Greetings, everyone. Hello. Welcome to Andromeda 7 Celestial Gateway. Your friendship, support, help, love, and knowledge and information exchange. And we're here to help you, and we're here to interact with you. And tonight we're so pleased to have Laird Scranton back on. Thank you, Laird, for coming back. Appreciate it. For those of you who missed it the first time around, Laird was on one of our Ancient Egypt, Esoteric Egypt programs, and he was talking about the Dogon people. And Laird is well known all around the world for his studies in ancient cosmology. He takes a look at different cultures and how they interacted with one another. He's spent an exhaustive amount of time researching the ancient folks of the Dogon, the Göbekli Tepe, right, in Turkey, Skara Brae in the Orkneys, which we'll be talking about tonight, and numerous books and credits to his name. He's starred in a lot of different, he's been a guest in a lot of different podcasts. He's been on Gaia channel and just various radio programs that are out there. So we gave him an exhaustive introduction the last time. I don't want to take up too much time from him. But he has the book, The Mysteries of Skara Brae, and the newest one. What is it called, Laird? Your second book?
Tracing Orkney's Origins.
Tracing Orkney's Origins. And so he's found out a little bit more and come back around to update that. I want to thank Dalibor Suchi from Germany coming in tonight to join us in the discussion. I think Mandy Moo from Australia will be joining us a little later. She's getting herself set up right now. And of course, our lovely, great show host and co-host, Lori, Pure Love Ascension, for putting all this together and making this happen. So we really appreciate that, Lori. So Lori, you normally say hello to folks that are in our chat room. We have a lot of listeners that aren't in chat, but we want to acknowledge our
let's do a holler.
Folks.
Slightly Slanted was in earlier. Let's see, we got David Castle. Thank you, David. Love to Rufus. Brenda, Milky's mom. Great show on Saturday. I'm really sorry I missed that, but I was out having some fun for a change. Robert V, very glad you could make it. You're not working. That's interesting. Wow, glad you're here.
Yeah.
Lucky Stone, it's always a pleasure. Good to have you with us. Let's see, who else? Kills, my sister. Good to see you, Kill.
Hey, Kelly.
And let's see, Mandy Moo is in chat. She's working on getting on. Good.
Delaney.
And Delaney Pearl Jones, there you are. Good to see you. Always a pleasure to have you on as well.
Yep.
And Walking on Water is with us too, saying hello to you, Teresa.
Oh, hi, Walking Water. Good to see you. And a warm welcome for Laird's friends who will be listening and tuning in. He's got some folks across the seas who will be tuning in later. And welcome to our audience and our participants that are not in the chat room. You're welcome to drop in anytime, or if you just want to kick back and relax, that's cool too. So, but thank you for being with us and watching. So Laird, let us, I come from my whole heritage is 3/4 Anglo-Saxon. I might have a last name that's Italian, but I'm only 1/4 Italian, but most of my family goes all the way back to parts of England, but mostly Ireland and Scotland areas. I know there were some Druids in the mix there too. So we do have some of that in our family history. But mostly potato farmers and fishermen, they migrated to America. And so my heritage, I'm very interested in anything having to do with, the Celts and early civilizations. And I was shocked, even after all those years of college and education, to find out the Celtic connections to other parts of the world, in particular to places like Egypt and other civilizations, or any similarity to some of these tribal groups. And I'm sure our panel has a lot of questions for you, but I thought, what got you involved in doing the research for Skara Brae?
Well, actually, I didn't know anything about Orkney or Skara Brae. I had been sort of pursuing comparative studies of an ancient symbolic system that sort of moved geographically. It started in Africa with the Dogon tribe in Mali, in Northwest Africa, and then moved to Egypt and to India and Tibet and China, to the Göbekli Tepe region. And in response to an email that I received from a person I didn't know, a person in Australia, asking, did I think that there could have been Egyptian influences at Skara Brae? And I wanted to respond to it, so I didn't know the first thing about it, so I started looking into it. So my first perspective, because of the way that question was framed, was that what I was looking at on Orkney were ancient Egyptian influences on Orkney.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty quickly, I figured out that was sort of a confusing perspective, because ancient Egypt, dynastic Egypt, really didn't take form until after the heyday of the Orkney era. It was a few hundred years after. Orkney, around 3200 BC, is when the most interesting things were happening on Orkney. There was a documentary in 2017, a BBC documentary hosted by Neil Oliver, that it's called Britain's Ancient Capital, Orkney. And his team's conclusion was that at 3200 BC, there were some very interesting and poorly understood things going on Orkney. Mm-hmm. But so even so, I took the perspective of, okay, could ancient Egypt have mounted an expedition to Orkney in that era? And if so, what kind of things would I expect to see? Unfortunately, Orkney is not a place where, like ancient Egypt, where you walk in Egypt, if you walk 3 feet, you trip over an artifact, mm-hmm. or a temple or whatever. On Orkney, that's not true. There's a very scarce amount of evidence, and only a few modes of evidence to be looked at. It's so old. The first inhabitants there arrived sometime after 4000 BC. Basically, you have architecture to look at. You have they know things about agricultural techniques and agricultural related animals and things that the original farmers had there. We have language references to place names and things like that. We have legends from the Orkney region to look at. We have pottery and things like that. But what we don't have are the massive temples that you see in Egypt. Just the wealth of artifacts, pottery, and so forth. So, in trying to sort out, could there have been Egyptian influences there? I began with the main thing I had to look at, which was architecture. It turns out most of the modern references on Skara Brae are given in terms of the houses we see behind Teresa right now, which were not the original houses of the village. Those were all but one of those were rebuilt over the period of about 6,000 years, or 600 years. Sorry. Mm-hmm. But I did come across a children's book written and illustrated by a gentleman who happens to live not very far from me, where he documented the original plan, the plan of the original houses, which were all built to the same plan. And it's a stone house built in sort of a unique configuration. There's a picture that an image that I sent of the Skara Brae house in comparison to some other houses that we could bring up if you see it there. I think it's called Skara Brae and Dogon houses and First Dynasty Egyptian burial chamber. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now the Skara Brae houses all took the form of the top figure there. Researchers on Orkney can't connect that to any locality in the region. They consider the round room up at the top right to be a unique feature. They refer to it as a beehive cell. Doesn't connect to anything they have excavated in nearby Europe, in Scandinavia, in the rest of the United Kingdom. It's a unique architectural form. So I realized that around 3200 BC is the era when the Dogon tribe, which I had been studying, were seem to have been an ancient Egyptian. They had a close relationship with the Egyptians, so close that their society preserves many of the ancient Egyptian practices, observance of calendars and things like that. Many of the Dogon cosmological words are ancient Egyptian words. You can sort of predictably presume that if the Dogon do a thing, that the ancient Egyptians also did the same things in a similar way. So I began to check out about Dogon architecture. Most of the Dogon houses, because they live in the desert, about 8 hours distance across the desert from modern civilization in Mali, they build most of their houses from mud and most of their structures from mud. But occasionally they do build a house from stone. And when they do, it takes the form of the middle plan.
And kind of a standard setup for the way the houses were put together.
Yep, they do it. The stone structure is built in a similar way. It's flat stones laid without mortar, and on the top row of the stone walls, they turn the stones vertically along the top of the wall. Now, the Dogon build their house this way for a reason. They say that it has cosmological symbolism associated with it. What it represents is the body of a sleeping woman or a sleeping goddess. The round room is her head. The center room is her body cavity. The long rooms on the top and bottom are her arms, and the entryway are her sexual parts. So I could. They also have marked on that plan. The central rooms are marked as the main house, so the side rooms are sort of an option. At 2900 BC in ancient Egypt, we see burial chambers of the earliest dignitaries in Egypt being built to the same plan of that main house. The burial chamber of Narmer, who's considered to be the first pharaoh of Egypt, was built to that plan, and there are several others that have been found that are built the same way. So we have some connectivity here. I thought it was interesting that the Skara Brae house seems to take a stylized version of that same plan. Okay, now my perspective was that someone brought the house plan from Egypt or from Africa to Orkney. And I thought it was interesting that whoever implemented the plan on Orkney held true to the symbolism of the structure when they placed the hearth in the center of the body cavity, because it represents the heart. I thought that's interesting that they had enough of an awareness of what the symbolism was to do that. It was only later that I figured out that I had things backwards. The timing just doesn't work. That if it had to be the case that the Skara Brae house was the original and that it was implemented in with the Dogon and with the Egyptians after the fact. And so when the Dogon took the plan to Mali, into subtropical climates where they didn't need a hearth in the house, they just removed it. They moved it to the courtyard of the village.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
I know it's relatively new, but there are some similarities I'm seeing in the shape of the externals of these houses to the new findings in the city of Atan in Egypt that they just dug up. We did a show with Khadija on it not so long ago. The curved outer structures and the architecture of that being not straight lines or straight. Also, they had like a pit. You stepped down into a chamber, and it looked like they had a very similar layout to the Dogon. And it's fairly new, but it would be interesting to see what you come up with, or if you had a chance to even look at that.
I haven't had a chance to see that, but the place where the Egyptian burial chambers were found for First Dynasty people was Abydos, and there are numbers of elements at Abydos that are all they all look like homage to Orkney. They chose to try to explain what the situation is. There's another image we can bring up to try to start to explain that. It's the image of sunset over Hoy at the equinox.
Oh, yes.
It's
beautiful.
Gorgeous. Wow.
Okay, now this is a view from what's probably the oldest standing stone structure on Orkney. called the Standing Stones of Stennis.
Mm-hmm.
And nearby that spot, there's also a pillar called the Watchstone, from which observations of these mountains are on an island called Hoy. And the symbolism of the mountains is very important. I'll get into that in a little bit.
Uh-huh.
Right now, what's important is that this is a highly significant feature that was brought forward in any number of ancient cultures, including Egypt, for very purposeful reasons. Now, Abydos, the cemetery at Abydos, where the equivalent of that house structure was set, where Narmer's burial chamber was set in view of two similar mountains called, actually with a gap in between, that was referred to as Pega the Gap. But according to Om Seti, the name Abydos was originally Abdu, and the meaning of the name was the desired mountain. So we know from the name of the place that the location was selected deliberately because of its relationship to those mountains.
Mm-hmm.
In Hinduism, it's flatly said that was a technique, that important sites were deliberately situated to be in view of mountains that they interpreted to look like elephants, reclining elephants. To try to get you an idea of why that was important on Orkney, cosmologically, what we're doing is, when we get down into the energetics, we're trying to reconcile two modes of time. One is linear time that's experienced materially, and the other is an oscillation of time that's experienced non-materially. Now, linear time is represented by the dynamic of sunrise to sunset, which we see through those mountains on Orkney, that the sun rises in the east, it sets in the west between those two mountains. What's pictured there is the equinox sunset, which is squarely between the two mountains. Now, the second dynamic is represented by the oscillation of seasons from solstice to equinox to solstice. We also have that pictured on Orkney with those mountains because, as I said, the sun that I pictured there is setting at the equinox squarely between the mountains. So anyone standing at the Watchstone on Orkney could automatically have view of a natural calendar because of where the sun set. They could track its motion behind those mountains and have a natural view of where we were in the cycle. And that would help know when to plant crops and when to harvest crops and things like that. But cosmologically, what we're trying to do is we're trying to reconcile two modes of time. So any other group that followed the Orkney era that was looking to represent that same concept tried to establish themselves in a place where they could also do that. And they also did it for the agricultural reasons as well. But we can find examples all over the world. There are two different formats that the setup takes. The first is the one I'm talking about. The Orkney one is the quintessential situation. That configuration is called an Akhet in Egypt. There's a glyph that of a sun setting between two mountains that's referred to as the Akhet glyph. Ak is a word for light, and Het is a word for temple. So this is representative of a light temple. But,
wow, that is so cool.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Okay, so these cultures are deliberately setting things up to replicate that. That's the first feature of Orkney that I see being honored at Abydos, and the name demonstrates that they were trying to honor it. I was saying that it takes two configurations. The first one is that double mountain, two elephant approach with a gap in between that we see some places. The other one, localities like Elephantina are situated in view of a single mountain that looks like a sleeping elephant. And the same thing happens. You have the same effect if you watch the sunset or the sunrise behind that kind of a mountain. You can track the seasons the same way. I actually have a copy of a modern day text that someone sent a resident of Elephantine Island who said, well, it looks like summer is about here because you can tell by where the sun rises behind that mountain.
Mm-hmm. That's how they were able to figure out when to plant. They were very simple people, very self-sufficient. They had a lot of animals as well that they took great care of and had a lot of respect for. Yeah, quite fascinating.
Right,
So Laird, real quick, I have a question. You've got to answer this for me. So would you say that Skara Brae is older than ancient Egypt?
Yes, absolutely. It's older than dynastic Egypt by about at least 300 years.
Yes.
Okay. It looks to me as if the cosmological tradition on Orkney started around 3600 BC. There are questions about who the original farmers were that arrived on Orkney because no one knows for sure where they came from. And the issue is this: even though they can point to any number of different elements that were part of that original society that had to have been brought with the original farmers, when they examine any one of those elements, say, I'll give you an example of one. There's an ancient breed of sheep on Orkney Island that they can tell from DNA, from genetics, originated in the Near East sometime before 6000 BC in the region of Anatolia, the Fertile Crescent region, the Göbekli Tepe region. Okay, they take that element and they say, okay, we recognize that this originated in the Near East, but of course, that's where all the first domesticated animals originated. So of course it originated there. And it might have made its way to Orkney by any number of different paths across Europe or across the Mediterranean or by other ways of getting to Orkney. That doesn't tell us anything about who the people were who brought it.
Right.
Now they do that with each of the elements. They pick the element, they examine it, they figure out where it traces to. Many of them do trace back to Anatolia region sometime before 6000 BC, but in every case, they come up with an equivocal answer. There's a type of mouse, a vole on Orkney that's unique to the United Kingdom. They know it had to have arrived with the first farmers. And they've done DNA studies to try to figure out where it came from. And so they did testing of voles from regions nearby in Europe and Scandinavia to try to find a match for the mouse. But unfortunately, they couldn't come up with an exact match. The closest match they said they came up with was from Belgium. And so they're trying to infer from that. This is part of the BBC documentary I was talking about. They try to infer from that the people must have come from the region of Belgium who populated Orkney.
I'm sorry. More questions for you. I'm sorry. Don't mean to interrupt, but I got to know. So Robert V was asking if the weather was much different back then. And it's my understanding that the area was hit by a really bad storm, which exposed all this. So this was covered for a very long time. And is that true?
Orkney is a place that's characterized by very high winds.
Yeah.
Okay. The site was abandoned around 2600 BC. A lot of the sites on the island were abandoned, and some of the population moved south into the lower UK around 2600 BC. So it looks as if there was a change in climate that happened then. So we're not sure what the climate was before that. They can make certain inferences, but there's a lot of back and forth among experts as to what the actual climate had been there at that time. But considering the amount of agriculture and animal husbandry and other things that were going on there, it looks like it probably had a warmer climate than it does now. It had a very hospitable climate at that time.
Interesting. Yeah.
Okay, now what I do with my book, Tracing Orkney's Origins, is I take a different approach to those original artifacts. I say, let's not look at a single artifact. Let's look at a cluster of elements from agriculture, a cluster of architectural elements, a cluster of linguistic elements, cluster of elements from mythology and from cosmology. Let's take ritual cultural practices like burial practices and things like that, where you have a cluster of elements that define what was there when these farmers first arrived. If we take that approach, we discover that all of those clusters originate in the Anatolia region before 6000 BC. Not only that they move hand in hand with each other, and you can track where they moved and how they moved from island to island across the Mediterranean and out Gibraltar, up the coast of Europe, through the Hebrides and arrive on Orkney by around 3600 BC. There are any of number of elements that support that view of things. Not only that, the traditional view of some of the researchers in the Mediterranean is that someone was deliberately colonizing the major islands of the Mediterranean for agriculture from starting around 7000 BC.
They did find some artifacts, and I'm curious about this and wonder if you know anything about it. They had these stone spheres.
Yes.
And they're trying to figure out what those were used for. What could they possibly use a stone sphere for? Well,
I have some perspectives on that. I was talking before we started this event, we were talking about an art fair at Portland, Oregon.
Yes.
In Portland, Oregon. At that art fair one time, I came across an artist named his last name was Longquist, and he makes little geometric balls, very similar to those Orkney balls, that he uses to produce really interesting patterns in white sand. Now behind Teresa right now, you see a bay on the other, just the Skara Brae village is overlooking, that has a beautiful white sand beach that borders the bay. You imagine farmers on Orkney having to get through a long winter. The carving of one of these balls would make an excellent craft project over the winter. Once they finish carving the balls, you could use the geometric forms on the balls to make patterns in sand, so it would make an excellent toy for a child to play with on the beach.
That's interesting.
And when it comes time for harvest, the child who is now used to making patterns in sand on the beach can now use that same ball to make patterns in harvested grain, and in the process separate the grains from the stalks. So you can employ the kids in a productive way for the harvest by giving them these stone balls to play with.
Yeah, wow, fascinating.
So how big
interesting.
were these stone balls? What was the size range of them?
I've seen them. Some of them are as big as 4 inches in diameter. They're pretty hefty balls, and they're carved in different shapes, different geometric shapes, and they've been found not just on Orkney, but a few have been found in lower Scotland. I know that some were found on caves up on those mountains on the island of Hoy that we saw the sunset behind. So they may have had a ritual purpose, because the cave that they were found in had other ritual elements in it.
Well, I would theorize that, if you could somehow make a graph of all the balls that were found and graph all the sizes and the weights of these balls, that, if they made all the balls out of the same type of material, that would be a way of standardizing weights and measures, because those would all have the same diameter for the same weight.
Right, that's a possibility. I'm not sure anybody has explored that possibility carefully. There are a lot of different theories as to what they might have been used for. Mine is just speculation based on what I saw with the artwork in Portland, because it was so compelling that the artist was doing that with the stone balls.
Interesting.
I have a question. Yeah, since you mentioned the fact that the Orkney civilization is actually older than the Egyptian civilization, it would follow that the Egyptians would have had a word for that region, because we know that that the Egyptians had a word for Göbekli Tepe, and that was Get Petkai. Right. Which sounds very similar to Zep Tepi, which in Egyptian means the first time. Which almost, if you play with those words in your mind, it almost feels like Zep Tepi, Get Petkai, that the first time may have not even taken place in Egypt at all, but in Anatolia or Göbekli Tepe. Almost, it almost feels that way.
Wow.
Well, one way to get at this is the most direct connection that we have from ancient times to Orkney in terms of description comes out of ancient Greece. Pindar writes about the Elysian fields, which was the Greek notion of a kind of a heaven. This was connected to the underworld, and it was a place where a person who had lived a good life hoped to end up when they died. And Pindar describes an island situated at the edge of the from their perspective, Western Sea, a white island, a place of great winds like Orkney is. He even refers to it as Okeanos.
There you go.
Very
There you
similar.
go. Mhm.
Many reasons from the Greek standpoint to think that they were talking about Orkney, but the Greek tradition is traditionally understood to have come out of the ancient Egyptian, or corresponds to the ancient Egyptian tradition of the field of reeds, which is also the concept of a kind of an underworld or kind of heaven where the soul of the pharaoh, deceased pharaoh, would go, or who would work the agricultural fields after he died. And the perception really was also of two gateways, two akets. The idea was that the soul of the pharaoh would exit through the aket that was next to Abydos to gain entry to the field of reeds, where the soul would eventually exit through another aket into the underworld. So concepts of the underworld also relate to this idea of sunrise and sunset. When the sun dips below the horizon, it's said to go into the underworld. So we have some compatibility there of the way that the Egyptians reference things. The Egyptians also left carvings and paintings of what their sense of this field of reeds was, and the animals that they picture being there are animals that are native to Orkney. Many of the actions they show going on are appropriate to Orkney. The plants they're picturing are appropriate to Orkney. There are other words and phonetics and things that link to Orkney. So there's a reasonable perspective that the Egyptians might have been talking about it. The key term that pertains cosmologically is Aru,
Aru.
Yep. Arou is the way the Dogon language spells it, but it can be spelled other ways, transliterated other ways.
Ah,
That could itself sound a bit, if you twist it around long enough, that could be Orkney. Aru.
Now, what's interesting is that from the perspective of how I trace the tradition coming to Orkney, it passes through Malta in the era immediately before it arrives in Orkney. And virtually every element that establishing element that we see on Orkney at 3600 BC, we see in the immediately preceding era on Malta in similar form. Now,
did you say Aru? Did you say Aru?
Yeah, Arou.
OU.
It's the name of the type.
That sounds like Uluru in Australia too.
It's possible. Now,
Almost, yeah.
On Malta, you have a series of megalithic sites that were built from 4000 BC through around 2600 BC. One of them is called Hagar Quim. And Hagar Quim includes two stones that are set as kind of a viewing window, and framed between the two stones when you look through them is the island of Fiofla, which looks like a kind of a squared elephant, and where the function of the sun, the solstices and the equinoxes works the way I said it works at Elephantine and on Orkney. You can watch the sunset behind this island. As a matter of fact, in caves on Fiofla, they found skeletons of pygmy elephants. So there's even the direct relationship to the concept of an elephant on Fiofla. But the interesting thing is that Hagar Quim's name in the Maltese language means standing stones.
Wow.
Okay, so now my knowing that the tendency of the people who are involved in this tradition is to honor things they are immediately connected to in their past, it occurred to me to reconsider an ancient name for Orkney. It's one of the names was Orkneyar or Orkneyjar. Now, Orkneyjar. Now, there's no etymology for where that word came from. No one knows what it was originally meant to represent. But there are two ancient languages on Orkney. One is Norn, which has connections to Norwegian and doesn't really demonstrate correspondences to the cosmological terms I work with. The second language is a language called Faroese, and that language demonstrates ongoing connections to the words I work with. So in the Faroese language, the word orca means to stand or to endure, and the word kajarni means stones. So
Standing stones.
Standing
Standing
stones.
stones. Mhm.
Yeah, it's quite possible that Orkneyjar, that name, was adopted in the Faroese language in honor of the Hagar name in the language of Malta.
Laird,
Yeah.
we have a couple of questions from the audience for you that might not be directly related to the exact thing you're talking about right now, but we have Johan. Not a lot of information out there about the Picts.
Right.
Do you have any information on them?
Right. Okay, the earliest reference we have to Orkney is from a Scandinavian saga, and it's fairly late from my perspective, but what the Scandinavians report having found on Orkney when they arrived there were two groups living side by side with each other. One was a group of small-statured people who were of very odd appearance and behavior, called the Petty, and the second was a group of clerics, basically priestly people who always wore white, called the Pape, P-A-P-A. There's lots of evidence to support the idea that the Petty and the Picts are the same group. And there are ways to connect the names linguistically, and there are ways to connect them through other archaeological evidence and so forth. You go back into writings of the 1600s, and there are flat statements that equate the Petty with the Picts. So the Petty are the short-statured people. They correspond to, okay, we have to back up. The Dogon perspective is that in ancient times, they received instruction in cosmological science and in civilizing skills with a focus on agriculture at a remote location.
Okay.
Okay, what we find on Orkney at 3200 BC is a series of megalithic sites that I recognized as the correct sequence of shapes that represent sort of the alphabet of how matter forms, the way the Dogon describe it. If you had walked on Orkney and found carved letters in the shape of A, B, C, D, G, it wouldn't take a brilliant person to figure out they were trying to represent the alphabet and sequence. Well, that's sort of what we have on Orkney at 3200 BC. We have these sites connected by a road that led to the Skara Brae village that a person could walk through, that basically are walking through the stages of how the Dogon say matter forms. And the Dogon descriptions of how matter forms and the way they draw it, you can lay side by side with how Stephen Hawking or Brian Greene describes it, and you see they're talking about the same thing. This is science.
We got one more question here from William Swan Jr. What is the relationship between a field of reeds and the afterlife?
Okay. Cosmologically, the field of reeds is a place where the soul is able to access the underworld. So there's an idea of sort of a transition through a kind of a gateway that the imagined goal of the soul after a person died in Egypt was to make its way to the field of reeds, where it was allowed to have sort of an idyllic life, and then eventually the soul would move on to the underworld, to the realm of non-materiality. In the cosmology, reeds represent the first stirrings of matter. That the first how can I say this, hints or instances of material forms are represented as reeds, and drawn in ways that call to mind sort of the reeds that we see all around the Orkney as natural growths. All sorts of the Egyptian symbols are found in similar form on Orkney. But so the field of reeds was sort of this equivalent of what we might think of as heaven, but it's more complicated than that because there are cosmological relationships to the idea. If we're talking about several things simultaneously. We're talking about how universes form, how matter forms, how biological reproduction happens, and all the symbolism is shared symbolism among these themes. So that any symbol we talk about has potential meaning for numbers of different parallel themes.
Mm-hmm. Wasn't there at one point where in one of your books you talked about those mountains that you showed us earlier with the gap in between as being a potential model for one of the, I guess, tribal leaders or kings from the Orkney area to travel over to Egypt and became part of that community and helping to establish and build early Egypt using those mountains as a model for the pyramid shapes?
Not those as such. One of the early pharaohs, the one who was first involved in creating pyramid structures, although they weren't, they had not arrived yet at the standard, what we consider to be the standard pyramid form always. The pharaohs selected their own name, and this pharaoh chose to name himself Sene-Pharaoh. Now, Sene is a word that means image or reflection of, and Pharaoh is a name in Egypt. It was originally Per-Ah, but relates to the idea. There's a group of islands to the north and the east, just to the north and east of Orkney, called the Faroe Islands. And in the Faroe Islands, there are any number of interesting mountain peaks. And each of the first 4 pyramids that Sene-Pharaoh was involved in building very closely resembles one of those peaks in the Faroe Islands. So there's a perspective where we could argue that if the people who became the pharaoh class of Egypt were educated on Orkney and were familiar with the nearby islands of the Faroe Islands, that he might have deliberately tried to replicate these shapes that were familiar to him and he was fond of as pyramids. One of them in particular is the bent pyramid. They don't have, this is a pyramid that changes angle halfway up the pyramid. Mm-hmm. And there's no accepted explanation for why they did it. People have tried to argue, well, there was an engineering problem. As they got to building the pyramid, they realized they couldn't sustain the angle, and so they had to change it. Any number of different theories. But there's also a peak in the Faroe Islands that exhibits that same change in angle at that same point.
Well, in each of these ancient cultures, they have legends of being educated by some kind of a superior race or superior class of beings, and it's always like a small group that breaks off, gets educated, and then comes back. And my question would be, did they perhaps construct these monuments so that they would recognize the place when they returned in, say, 50 years? Like, for example, in the Mayan legends, they would always take 50 young men and have them educated somewhere else, and then 50 years later, they would bring them back. So, in 50 years, a lot could change. Right. So, and maybe those monuments were constructed to, so they knew where they belonged.
To keep them familiarized with the shapes. That's a possibility. Yep. The mindset that we're talking about for this education is one of the archetypes of Jung. This is the paradigm where, and the Dogon flatly say it, they say that 8 tribespeople were selected from each tribal group, were moved to a remote location, instructed in all these concepts, and then sent back to teach everyone else. The Skara Brae village is really well suited to as dorm housing for those kinds of students, because there were 8 chambers, main chambers at the Skara Brae village that could have housed students or their families. So that's one perspective, is that paradigm, which repeats itself all over the world, the paradigm of the 8 quasi-mythical emperors or ancestors or priests or they're different,
Teachers, guides,
teachers,
yeah.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Having brought civilizing skills in ancient times, plays out all over the world, in culture after culture.
Well, yeah, but the 8 that also ties into Buddhism, and the 1 became 2, 2 became 4, 4 became 8, and then the 8 became 1, which is where 8 would be like the intersection of two space into 3 space.
Right. Yes, all of that could be true. That paradigm of the teachers, I guess the question we're still trying to answer is the building of those pyramids. Well, I didn't really relate it to Orkney, but more to the pharaohs that are situated nearby. One of the questions I asked when I was writing The Mystery of Skara Brae was, I knew that it looks like a similar era of instruction happened at Göbekli Tepe at around 9000 BC. And it was clear that the teachers, if they needed to take refuge, could have moved higher up into the mountains to have a safe space to get away from any threat that they might perceive. But on Orkney is sitting right out in the middle of the easy access by ocean current.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone who followed the Atlantic currents their boat would be led right to Orkney, north of Orkney, and then back down around towards Orkney. Yeah. So I asked, where would the teachers take refuge if they needed to take refuge? Well, the Faroe Islands are the easy answer because there are all sorts of natural defenses built into the Faroe Islands. It's very, very well naturally protected space. So that's the connection from my standpoint. And it's not so much that I think the students on Orkney had direct involvement in the Faroes necessarily. It's more that it looks like maybe the teachers did.
Mm-hmm.
There was a question in chat, and I thought it was interesting. Do you have any knowledge of Buddhism and what similarities between Buddhism constructs on physics and Skara Brae?
Actually, one of the ways that I'm able to infer what has to be true about the Dogon system is by comparison to Buddhism in particular. We have 2 symbolic systems, one in Buddhism, one with the Dogon, that are given in separate languages, one in Sanskrit and the other one in words that are Dogon words that very often relate to Egyptian and Hebrew words. Both are known to have been documented in ancient times, so we know we're dealing with ancient systems. Like Buddhism was documented, I think, by 400 BC, and the Dogon system it rests on Egyptian words that went out of use by around 700 BC. And plus we have the Dogon civic practices that go back to 3000 BC. So we know that we have 2 systems that are ancient, but a modern authority on Buddhism is in substantial agreement with a modern authority on the Dogon system as what the meaning of a symbol is, or a particular concept, or a particular ritual, a particular shape. So that demonstrates that the 2 cultures, independently of each other, managed to keep this very complicated system straight down through thousands and thousands of years.
Yeah, including the shape of the DNA molecule that they kept the shape of in their drawings.
Right. There's both the Dogon and the Egyptians in separate ways have descriptions and drawings of the DNA twisting molecule.
Twisting double helix, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Truth Seeker says much of Buddhism is in common with Hinduism.
Right. And there are also a separate set of very compelling connections between the Dogon system and Hinduism. As I mean, so compelling that I could tell, even though there's no outward overt connection between the 2 systems. No, there's no scholar who would tell you that the Dogon have any connection to Hinduism as such. There's no preservation of any of the Hindu gods or so forth in a form that anybody recognizes. Still, when we get down into the cosmological concepts they're talking about and the way words are formed and so forth, there are absolutely compelling connections between the 2 systems. So much so that I could tell from the Dogon system. The Dogon talk about the formation of a spiral of matter. And that spiral of matter has symbolism that connects to Ganesha, the elephant god in Hinduism.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that parallel to that material spiral of matter, the Dogon also talk about a non-material spiral of matter that is synchronized with it. And the non-material one, the symbolism of the non-material one would equate to feminine, not a masculine concept. Mm-hmm. So the Dogon system implied that there should have been a concept of a female Ganesha back in ancient times. So, and the relationship between the spirals is described as an embrace. So I went in search of any ancient description I could find in Hinduism or Buddhism in India or China or Japan or places like that of a female Ganesha whose relationship to the male Ganesha was an embrace or a hug. And what I discovered was there's really no little reference to it in India, that it was once known in China, but was banned from inclusion in a major volume on Buddhism at 1100 AD by an emperor, and from that point on was no longer mentioned in China. No existing image, no surviving image of it in China. But if you go to Shingon Buddhism in Japan, the concept survived. And so there you can find actual images of it. They're called kanjiten. I found descriptions in China of specifications of how you would build the statue to represent it if you wanted to have a figurine to represent it, how tall it should be, what materials it should be made out of, what features should be presented in the statue, and things like that. And eventually my wife came across one available for sale out of a group in India, and we actually purchased it for not very much money.
It's fascinating that, for example, the Egyptians actually had a word for vacuum, which they call, I believe, the formless void. Or they also had various weird expressions that you come across when you read the pyramid texts, like formless void, formless one, bornless one, which to my mind almost sounds like physics terms.
Well, now we have a huge advantage with ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic language because, and I have to back up here to explain, the Dogon don't have a written language, they only have a spoken language. But every syllable in the Dogon language relates to one or more concepts, what I call root concepts. And so you can sort of mix and match these syllables together to create larger words that represent more complicated concepts. And so you can predict from the pronunciation of any Dogon word what it likely represents. The same is true millennia later with the Maori in New Zealand. Their language works the same way based on very similar phonetics. I can predict from the sound of a word what it probably represents. Now, when we get to written language with the ancient Egyptians, every glyph works the same way. Each glyph, modern scholars interpret the glyphs as being like letters in the English language. They see these as phonetic syllables, or symbols. But most languages only try to represent about 40 some phonetic values, and we've got 4,000 Egyptian glyphs, more than 4,000. So it's pretty clear something besides phonetics was going on with the glyphs. When you compare how certain Dogon shapes with certain Egyptian glyph shapes, you realize that every glyph represents a concept. And in fact, there are certain words, Egyptian words, that assign meanings to certain glyphs. So what the goal of the scribe was when he sat down to write an Egyptian word was he was trying to represent a particular phonetic value, like with an English word, but he was also trying to pick from those 4,000 glyphs a sequence of glyphs that explained the meaning he was trying to write. It works sort of like a rebus puzzle where you see a picture of an eye and you say I. Well, same thing with the Egyptian words. You see a particular symbol, you substitute a concept, and you create a symbolic sentence that tells you what the word means. The word for week reads 10 days. It's the definition of the Egyptian week. In ancient China, their word for week was formulated the same way. It also reads 10 days, and they also had a 10-day week. Every Egyptian word works that way, so we don't have to guess what the nuances of meanings of the words were. The words flatly tell us what they mean.
Yeah. We have a guest, Joe P, and I hear what he's saying, but I just can't. I find it hard to believe that all these different civilizations developed independently of one another with the same concepts without some type of contact between them. Joe says there seems to be a possible indication of consistency between science searching across vast amounts of time and cultures.
Science is purely objective, whereas the cultural interpretation of science, or the way cultures may write about science, would change. Would change not only across cultures but also across time.
Yeah.
Well, this is not the perspective that we're working from. What's being represented here, and we have the Buddhists and the Dogon to compare to because they both flatly represent what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
The mindset is that in ancient times, someone who understood the science thoroughly, this is not theory, this is statement of fact, was responsible for instructing the civilizing plan, and it was a global instruction. They did what they could to reach cultural groups all around the globe. And they were talking about concepts that extend down further than quantum science. As a matter of fact, I'm finishing up a manuscript right now that takes it all the way to the bottom of the all the way to the bottom of the creational construct, down to domains of root energy and how you trace upwards from that to get to matter. This is what the Dogon are talking about. Now, anybody in ancient times who was talking about that would not have had a problem reaching any place on the planet they wanted to reach. And so the reason, from this mindset, the reason why all these cultures have these concepts in common is because they all received the same instruction from the same group. Now, the other thing about instruction is that it was highly, highly, highly mnemonic instruction. It was self-reinforcing systems, such that the way you plowed your field helped reinforce a scientific concept you learned. The way you built your hut helped reinforce scientific concepts you learned. At Göbekli Tepe alone, we have certain concepts represented a half dozen times in different ways in the symbolism that's there. This is a very self-reinforcing system with the idea of a person not being able to forget what the thing represented. Plus, there was a class of symbols preserved in Buddhism called adequate symbols, where it's understood that the meaning of the symbol, even if the trail of initiates completely forgets what the symbol represents, the meaning can't ultimately be lost because the shape is a shape that can be observed in nature, and the meaning of the symbol is what that shape is responsible for in science or in nature.
So do you have a theory as to what the civilizing influence may have been, or where they may have originally come from?
I don't need a theory about it because they flatly tell us what you get past aliens. A certain point. You get past a certain point back in time, and every word and every representation flatly tells you what it means. At 500 BC, Confucius was very upset because the trend in China was that Chinese words no longer did that, and he saw it as a terrible loss. If you can get back to the original names of things in the era of around 3000 BC or before, you don't have to guess what it represents. They flatly tell you what it represents. And so the Dogon, the Buddhists say that their most sacred symbols were gifted to humanity by a non-human source. In Hinduism, it's also flatly represented that anything that's truly esoteric knowledge originated with a non-human source. The Dogon go a step further and they say not only was it non-human, it was originally non-material. Now, my problem as a researcher is I can take the stance, I can try to take the stance that, oh yes, the Buddhists and the Dogon managed to keep all these intimate details of their symbolic system straight for thousands and thousands of years, but somehow they forgot who they got it from, and they somehow forgot in matching ways who they got it from. Or I can say they kept that last detail straight also, and now I have to test the reasonableness of a statement that a non-human source that was originally non-material somehow took action materially in the era of Skara Brae and Orkney.
Wow. Hmm.
That's kind of earth-shattering.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
Now,
also kind of affirming for me.
Mm-hmm.
let me try to
I'm
explain to you
enjoying
how,
every second of this.
let me try to explain to you how it becomes thinkable that happens.
Okay.
Einstein says an increase in mass slows time.
Hmm.
Okay.
The Samkhya, which is the root philosophy in India, it's a companion to yoga, and the Dogon, whose system looks to be based on Samkhya, both say universes form in pairs, and that there's a cycle of energy that scrolls from one universe to the other one progressively. It's a cycle. It flows one direction, then it flows the other. But not just energy, but also mass. Now, if we have a persistent increase in mass in our universe, then we also, according to Einstein, have a persistent slowing of time in our universe. That's why when we look out into the universe with our telescopes, when we do calculations, it looks to us like the rate of expansion of the universe is speeding up. No, it's not. Our time frame's slowing down. Okay,
So-
now, if that's true, then if you think of this cycle of energy as a year, then another way to think of it, of the scrolling energy, is of sand in an hourglass. It begins in the top globe and it filters down into the bottom globe.
Hmm.
Okay, at the middle of that cycle, you have the same amount of sand in the top globe as you have in the bottom globe. If that sand represents the pace that time is running at, then at the middle of the cycle, you've equalized time frames. Now it becomes thinkable that someone in one universe can cross over into the other universe.
Uh-huh.
Wow.
It's the same concept that lets a person in a submarine exit the submarine. They step into an airlock. They
Mhm.
equalize pressure with the outside of the water outside of the submarine,
Right.
and then they can step out.
Good
We're doing
analogy.
the same thing, only with time, not with water pressure.
So
Wow.
Wow.
could maybe the difference or the discrepancy between the observable matter in the universe and the actual matter in the universe, as explained by dark matter, could that be an influx of matter coming in from this non-material universe into our material universe, according to this theory?
It could be. I don't have a specific perspective on how dark matter relates to that concept, but it seems entirely possible to me that it does. I do know that scientists are hugely confused by the fact that there's everywhere they look with their telescopes, they discover there's magnetism. Even in places where there's no matter, they discover magnetism. Where it's the magnetism coming from? And they can only conclude that the magnetism was a primordial effect that expressed itself in our universe.
In our universe, yeah.
Wow, Laird, that's just mind-blowing, because you've got to be one of the few in your field that has actually stepped out and made this connection and has expressed it the way you have. Because there's not very many of you that would take that risk.
Well, my job is, okay, I was taught by my science teachers that when you're exploring a question and there are 2 or 3 different possibilities as to what might be the answer to the problem you're trying to solve, that what a scientist is supposed to do is take each of those possibilities and sincerely entertain the givens of that possibility and the consequences of those givens, and follow them out until they hit a contradiction. If they don't hit a contradiction, then the question is, how well does this explain the facts that we see? Well, the problem with questions that relate to ancient cosmology is that no scientists are typically not willing to actually entertain the perspective. An easy way to demonstrate that is, I posted about this on Facebook this week. Science understands that dimensionality is what allows us to measure. If we didn't have linear dimensions, we wouldn't have a concept of measure. But no one in science tries to talk about where the dimensions come from.
We can't even define what a dimension is.
Right. So
Right.
if you want to find the point of overlap or the jumping off point to try to reconcile the Dogon perspective to the scientific perspective, you sincerely entertain that question of where do dimensions come from, and you'll start stepping into the domain of what they're talking about. And it's inescapable. if you're going to sincerely address that question, there are issues you have to deal with, and the Dogon are dealing with them. And all I have to do is say, is this a reasonable way of understanding it? Would it make sense? If we looked at it that way, would it make sense that that's the way it works? And it does.
That's
Wow.
As
great.
a matter of fact, it makes such sense that virtually all of the key stumbling blocks of the scientific perspective, everything that we call quantum weirdness evaporates. What it comes down to is a handful of dynamics of energy that are defined in the very first instance of at the very most how can I say, the most foundational set of these dynamics of energy define a pattern that repeats on all upward scales. If you understand it on any scale, you can apply what you understand to all the other scales, and it works exactly the same way all the way up and down. It's like octaves on a piano. It doesn't matter which octave you learn, you can apply that knowledge of the octave all the way down the piano keyboard.
Mhm.
Wow.
Mhm.
And speaking of which, it's also interesting that there's 88 keys on a piano, there's 88 known constellations, as well as 88 disciples of Christ.
That's very interesting.
Wow.
Yeah, because
88
Christ,
disciples of Christ.
yeah,
Hey,
Christ had 12
don't
apostles
step
and
on my
88
piano
disciples.
keyboard theory of creation.
Yeah. But what if I'm just saying that it could be related that the piano keyboard was originally created as a mnemonic for memorizing, say, the constellations.
It could be. I mean, stages of matter of material formation work that way, where the eighth stage is the initiating stage of the next octave, so to speak, of energy.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which would also explain like unbelievable coincidences, because if what you're saying is true with matter from one universe leaking into another universe, at one point they were created, they were at the same point in time, which means that at that same point in time everything that exists now existed then and was linked at the same time. So since matter and time expanded, they're still connected, although not in the same place but at the same original time.
Okay, as far as that
That's
brings us
tricky.
to questions of quantum entanglement, where it looks like you can take two electrons and make them look like they behave as if they're one electron.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, the thing you need to consider is us talking face to face right now in all the different locations we're in.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not true that we're all entangled with each other. The only thing that's true is we have technology that works so ultra quickly that it's transparent to us that we're not in the same place as each other.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what quantum entanglement is. It's a factor of speed of time, pace of time. And there's a domain of overlap between non-materiality and materiality at every point in space and time.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can induce two electrons to interact with each other in that space, you end up with ultra quick connection as opposed to everyday normal connection. And they've measured it. It's 10,000 times more quick. They've compared how interactions between electrons that are entangled compared to unentangled, and the difference is a speed of 10,000 times.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Yo.
Yeah. Wrap your brain around that.
Same thing with the duality of waves and particles. That the Dogon perspective is this is a phase transition like water turning into ice. It just it happens so quickly. It compares to how quickly digits turn into an image on your screen. You remember back in the 90s, you would sit patiently and watch your screen build in segments. It still builds in segments, but now it happens so fast that we don't notice it anymore.
Yeah. True. Very true. Huh.
Well, that might explain why in this reality that other spirits or other beings, however you want to put it, that are in different dimensions have to step down or lower the speed or frequency in order to interact with us. And likewise, there are others that have to up theirs in order to interact with us. And
there are also effects like with UFOs that happen so ultra quickly we can't believe that the physics allow it to happen.
Right.
True.
Yeah.
Okay, we have other circumstances where it looks like certain scientific effects are threatening to be measured at faster than the speed of light. But if those effects are happening in a domain of energy that itself runs quicker than our domain, then it might not be faster than the speed of light in its own frame. Just faster for us.
Right.
Mhm.
But yeah, you know, if you hear a tone and you think it's a buzzing noise, and then you hear a lot of garbling, it might actually be something trying to communicate.
Right.
But
If you can slow it down enough.
And we do that in paranormal investigating. We do that. We play with the EVP sounds, you know.
And you also speed it up, slow it
we
down.
speed it up, we slow it down to try to
True.
hear.
Yep.
And that's what Khadija was experiencing inside the pyramid when she, I don't know if you caught that show, Laird, but a few weeks ago, she showed us some live footage going through the Grand Gallery. And something caused her whole video to slow down into slow motion.
Wow.
And she didn't do it manually because you can't on the iPhone. You have to stop one video and start another at a different speed. And we can't necessarily. Now, we can slow down her video, but we can't change the voice recording. So it's like it would take an awful lot to doctor it, and Khadijah's just not, you know, she's not technical. So, but she sends us the video clip, and we're like, what the hell? And
Right.
you could hear other voice, not hers, trying to come in.
Yep.
You know, and the lights flickering and the orbs floating, and then the slowing down of something was trying to come through. And I think there's a lot of that going on.
I can believe that that's possible with the right energetics.
Yeah.
Yep. We've just forgotten how to tune in, and more of us are becoming more aware of it and trying.
Well, we're doing it with
Tune in.
technology, and technology, like I believe Asimov said, it is indistinguishable from magic.
Right.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And
So
we're the technology, though.
Exactly.
too.
So
Yeah.
what may have been esoteric to these people thousands of years ago may have just been a form of technology that was transferred to them by a non-material, or for want of a better word, extraterrestrial group of beings or people. But for all we know, those could have been us. Those could have been time travelers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I sometimes feel like, or I sometimes think, were those ancient people, sitting around their campfires, were they thinking of us? Could they have even conceived of us? Because it just boggles the mind.
Okay, I'll give you another example to think about that sort of is a good metaphor for these concepts. Imagine you're standing at the bottom of a hill looking at a road that extends into the distance, and you see the perspective of the road. It looks like the sides of the road approach each other closer and closer and closer until they meet at a point at the top of the hill.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now, if we analyze that mathematically, what we arrive at the top of the hill is a singularity.
Mm-hmm.
However, if we approach that question from a standpoint of direction and distance, we end up seeing what's on the other side of the hill. Because when you get to the top of the hill, you realize it's not different from what it was at the bottom of the hill, it just looks different from where we're at.
Mm-hmm.
Perspective, yeah. It's like magic. When you know the trick, it's not really magic anymore, is it?
No, it's not.
Yeah, true.
Wow.
Now, the other interesting thing is that when you start dealing with the energetics and you get down to the bottom of the system, where the place where it starts, everything that we think of as being symbolic becomes literal. That the descriptions they've given us that seem quaintly or even insightfully symbolic at the levels we think about them at, when you get down to the root energetics, point after point after point becomes literally, objectively a true way of representing what happens.
Mm-hmm. And this is evidenced by things like the very existence of the alphabet. It's not just the letters that are the same across cultures and the way they evolved, but also the order is the same, with very few exceptions. Like, for example, in the Greek alphabet, it's alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, where for the most part they preserve the order of the letters.
Right.
Not just the letters themselves, which I find kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, well, because the order of the letters shouldn't matter at all in constructing a language if each of those letters means a certain sound.
But it is important when it comes as a mnemonic for learning a thing.
Yes.
Okay, so if someone learned it by the mnemonic, then you understand why they transmitted it to their child using the same mnemonic, because that's the way they remember it. When our children were very young, we were thinking about going to a county fair, but our children were so young that it occurred to us, if somehow we get separated from them in the crowd, how are they ever going to find us? They're too young to know their address and their phone number. How are they going to find us, be reconnected with us? So we decided to teach them their address and their phone number, to sing it to the tune of a children's song. And
easy way for kids to remember.
20 or 30 years later, that adult friends of ours who had a need to remember our address realized they could just sing the song to themselves, and they had it.
Brilliant.
We always knew our address and phone number when we were kids as well.
Yeah,
we didn't have
thing.
phones back. I mean, no cell phones or anything like that. You got lost. You were out.
You had to find a payphone, and then
And they had alphabet too. So I remember, as a small kid, if I wanted to find my mom, or if I wanted to go visit my mom's cousins, who I called all aunts and uncles, because that was another thing. It's Emerson 30250.
Yes.
Emerson 30250. And I still remember it to this day, and I was only 4 or 5. Emerson 30290.
It's true.
It is amazing. Mnemonics are hugely powerful things. And one of the books I wrote is focused on those kinds of techniques that you can see were being used with the symbolism, that point to the hand of a really capable set of teachers who put this stuff together. This wasn't by accident.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, I would be curious to know. Oh, go ahead.
David Castle says, I used to make songs up and memorize history in grade school. I did the same exact thing. I had a Abraham Lincoln deal that I had to memorize, and I sung it in my head. And, it's a good way to memorize things. It's interesting.
Well, they teach you that in drama class too. They teach you the same thing in drama. But Laird, I'd be curious, now that we've said all this, here's the next challenge. And that is, where do you think, based on everything you've learned so far, where do you think of the concept of reincarnation in all of this? Previous lives.
Reincarnation is not a concept that, it's not one of the signatures of the system. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. A qubit is a signature of the system. Anybody who was instructed in this tradition measured with qubits in ancient times. Another signature is the idea that there's a wheel or a chariot associated with Orion, the constellation. Okay. Any culture that thought that, I can predict with certainty that they were influenced by the same tradition. Reincarnation is not one of those signatures. Reincarnation is a concept that turns up in sort of hit and miss in some cultures and not in others. And so I don't have a way of anchoring that back to the original tradition. The approach I take to this material is a little bit like the old board game called Clue, with the candlestick in the library. Okay, you say you think it's Colonel Mustard with the candlestick in the library, and I'm holding my hand of cards, and I have the candlestick here, so I show it to you and say, can't be. You have to be wrong. Here's the candlestick. Okay, that's sort of the way that I approach these questions. Is, do I have a card in my hand that I can show you to say absolutely that can't be true? Well, I don't have a way of demonstrating absolutely the reincarnation is a foundational concept of this tradition. It appears in some cultures, not in others. The Dogon flatly say, or actually the anthropologists who studied the Dogon flatly say, they had no concept of reincarnation that went beyond genetics. So my impulse is to say that reincarnation might or might not be a thing. It falls in the category of open questions for me, and I don't have a firm fix on.
But at the same time, every ancient culture has a tradition of ghosts.
Right. Now, even the Dogon do also. The Dogon say that the purpose of a funeral is to reassure the deceased. Okay, the Dogon say that people have 4 souls, which makes me think that we're talking about a dimensional effect, because we have 4 dimensions involved in materiality. But the Dogon say that one of those souls has an option to hang around after death. And the purpose of a funeral is to convince that soul that it doesn't need to, that things are so good here that there's absolutely no reason for it to worry and have to hang around. We've got things under control. Feel free, go ahead and leave.
That almost sounds like the Balinese ritual.
There's a certain percentage of those souls that decide to hang around anyway. And so what the Dogon do is every so often they'll hold a generic funeral, not for anybody, just as an opportunity for those souls to choose to move on again.
Wow.
Interesting. Yeah, I mentioned the Balinese ritual, which is kind of along those lines, where it's unlike a Western funeral where it's all sad and everybody's crying. They go out of their way to be happy and rejoicing and dancing and singing. So kind of
Same
almost
idea.
related. Yeah, same idea.
Same idea.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
you have
the
cultures-
Egyptians say death is only the beginning. So
Well,
Yeah.
one of the confusing things is that very often in these ancient cultures, the goddess who was a goddess of birth is also responsible for death. And so really the common denominator is a transition, not birth or death.
Yeah, well,
right.
Yeah,
There-
like Kali.
It's
Kali
like
in Hinduism.
Yeah. Transition.
Right.
it's also like the divine feminine has 4 aspects. It's and you'll see it in Native American tradition. You'll see it in Theosophy and others. Is mother, well, virgin or maiden, mother, great mother, and crone. The crone is the one that guides you through your passing on, your death, and of course, virgin was the virgin birth, giving the birth, life. The ones in the middle are your guides for continuation in your life cycle. So there's different aspects, and I think that a lot of these ancient people were like with Bastet, for example. Khadijah's not here, but I don't mean to pick on Khadijah, or her goddess, but Bastet had 2 aspects. Early on, the lion, and then later on the cat. So you have, Sekhmet, and you have Bastet, right?
Uh-huh.
So they're 2, they're life-giving and nurturing aspects, or warrior and mother aspect.
You could almost tie that in with the Christian philosophy as well, where Christ was born of a virgin, but his friend John the Baptist was born of an old woman.
Right.
Elizabeth was over 70 years old when she gave birth to John the Baptist.
But they were both miracles.
Yes.
Mm.
So that's 2 opposite ends of the divine and feminine spectrum.
It's like Abram and Sarah, before Abram became Abraham, and
Yeah.
Sarah became Sarah.
Yeah.
She was also a dry womb. A dry
Yes.
womb, elderly, but was inseminated.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm. So you have this recurring aspects of feminine and masculine energy portrayed in different cultures.
Right.
And that's back to what Lair's saying. All it's coming from one source.
Yeah.
It's coming from source.
Fascinating.
Mm-hmm, it is.
And source is non-matter, which means source is energy.
Spirit.
Right. Right.
Spirit and energy.
One of the go-to people for understanding the Hinduist perspective on all this stuff is Rene Guénon. He died in 1952. But he wrote a series of books that I can tell you that I was astounded. I only recently got around to actually reading them myself. I knew he was a go-to reference or source of Adrian Snodgrass, who is my authority for Buddhist symbolism. But Rene Guénon's books, I have a habit of marking passages that are significant to what I'm studying for one reason or another. And these books are just replete with post-it tabs. I can hardly read a sentence without marking it. He's so entirely on the same page about things, approaching it from a Hindu's perspective, as opposed to me approaching it from the Dogon perspective.
Wow. A lot of similarities there.
And one advantage I have waiting this long to have read him is that I have enough of an overview to be able to read it critically. And so I can tell when he's moving off track of what he can actually defend and when he's speculating and when he's not.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a helpful thing.
Well, I would propose that those of us who see or have memories of or have visions of previous lives in previous locations and situations, I think that what we're doing is remembering ourselves in different timelines, different dimensions. Not a linear progression over time.
Mm-hmm.
There is no time in linear time, but there's no real linear time. It's all within frequency, all within different dimensions.
In other words, same
So I
notes,
might exist
different
in,
scale.
Yeah.
There you go. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Very
That's what
good.
I think
way.
it is.
Mhm.
Yep.
Wow. Fascinating.
Fascinating. That's just putting it out there. That's so far. That's where I'm getting what I'm getting. Who knows? Tomorrow it might feel differently.
Mhm.
But is there anything else? We're approaching 10:30, so we've been on for about an hour and a half. So I just wanted to remind everybody what time it is, and Laird, was there anything else you wanted to share from? I mean, that was an incredible amount of information you got.
No doubt.
I'm happy to answer any other questions, but that is it seems like a good stopping point to me.
Yeah, I think it's what you have discovered so far is just fascinating. What's your next project? What are you working on now?
I'm just finishing up editing right now on the book about the energetics, and and believe me, this is a comprehensive view of how an awful lot of the things work and how they're represented symbolically, tracing the Dogon perspectives on these things down to the actual root energies where they start, and tracing them all the way forward to the point where the cycle reverses itself. And it's really, really interesting stuff.
Wow.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Is it something
Definitely.
you're currently researching, or are you writing?
No, I finished writing. I still the dynamic of what happens is that the more you get into this stuff, the faster the pace of information comes at you. So it's sort of a trick to get the information to slow down enough to be able to wrap up a book. But I'm at the point of wrapping up this book, and I'm still adding. Occasionally, I'm learning something that I want to add to it. But I'm within weeks of probably self-publishing this book.
Cool.
Truth Seeker has one last question, and can you ask about the connection to Harappa and Mohenjo-daro?
Mohenjo-daro.
About that?
I have not directly studied either of those cultures to be able to speak.
They were in the Indus River. They were Indus River civilizations of northern India.
I know that one of the paths of transmission of the tradition is out of the Fertile Crescent region, south and east into India. And so anything that connects along that path is likely influenced by the same tradition, and also likely influenced by the Shakti cult tradition, which is a feminist, a matriarchal tradition, has sort of a scary side to it, but it's all the same stuff. Many of the Shakti cult traditions are seen actually on Orkney. On Orkney, they discovered mass burials of dismembered bones that had been burned, and the skulls had been opened at the top of the skull. And for years, they interpreted it as proof of warfare on Orkney in ancient times. What they didn't realize is they were looking at a burial tradition that's already well documented with groups like the Shakti cult. This is a known set of things that go together. It's a way of disposing of deceased bodies that had symbolism to it that connects forward to traditions in India, in Egypt and other places later on. So they. I'm
That
sure
all sounds like that vaguely sounds like the sky burial tradition of Tibet.
It is. It's the same tradition. The body is left out to natural elements for a period of maybe 4 days, and then the bones dismembered, sometimes burned, usually commingled in the group burial with the skull separated, but the skull is frequently opened at the top to allow the soul to ascend.
That's what I was thinking. The crown.
Yeah.
Then midway through the tradition, there are reversals in symbolism that happen, so that by the time you get to Egypt, they're no longer doing that. What they're doing is they're wrapping the body like a mummy and opening the mouth to allow the soul to be reborn.
Mm-hmm.
The Egyptian word that represents this is written with two glyphs. One that Budge says represents the crown of the skull, and the other one is a mouth.
Uh-huh.
Same
Wow.
tradition.
The opening of the
Interesting.
mouth ritual. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, familiar with that.
Interesting.
Wow.
One of the researchers, a traditional researcher, was looking at Orkney and made a comment in one of her studies. She was studying two styles of pottery that characterize the Orkney tradition that were seen for a long time as representative of two different groups that had been involved on Orkney in different, maybe one right after the other. But she noticed that one style of pottery had only ever been found in houses that were entered from the left, and the other style had only ever been found in houses that had been entered from the right. And she said, this is symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
And so from my point of view, those styles of pottery represent another one of these symbolic reversals. Left is non-material, right is material. Left is feminine, right is masculine.
Mm-hmm.
At the Orkney era of in the cycle, you're at the flipping point. You're at the equinox, like the picture I showed you of the sun between the mountains.
Mm-hmm.
This is the equinox of those energies. This is the point where things are reversing, and so they're all sorts of elements, factors that reverse.
That almost sounds like feng shui a bit.
Right, almost like it. Another way I explain it is, I think I've used this example with you last time around about a plane load of people who are flying across country. Now, the chances are that you don't know more than one or two other people on the plane, and you probably don't even talk with more than a handful of other people on the plane in your trip. But still, when you get to your destination, everyone knows to change their watch by 3 hours.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, it's not because it was communicated among them in any way. It's because they know how time zones work. They got to wherever they were going. They switched their watch to match the time zone they're in. Same thing with the symbolism. All these cultures know how the time zones work. They know it's time to flip the symbolism.
Wow.
It's amazing.
Fascinating.
A
Thank you,
project
Laird.
Project Skyfalls is like, she says she doesn't remember all her past lives. I was just talking to that with Lori today a little bit. I don't think we're meant to. I think things are revealed to me, or at least things have been revealed to me minimally over time for specific reasons.
I agree.
Like the universe wants me to know, or the source maybe wants me to know about a person or about an interaction with a person to help me make that connection, or to help me see it through, and
Almost like,
or maybe some lessons learned from that particular lifeline will impact what I'm doing right now. Go ahead, Delbert.
it's almost like Groundhog Day, where you get a chance to, repeat the same course of events over and over again and get better or have a different outcome in this life.
Yeah.
Because maybe it's something that should have happened differently in a different lifetime and it didn't. So you have the opportunity to correct that in this life.
Yeah. Well, it helped me to connect to certain people in our tribe that I may not have noticed to the extent that I have. So if I have a memory about Brian Lunsford, or a memory about Michelle, or lots of memories about Lori, or certain people, and I David Barry, and even you, Dalibor, there's a connection, and it helps you to make. It's like you're shocked into going, I know that person.
Right.
I had a life with that person. I had a role with that person.
And
it might be a different dimension. It might be somewhere else. But the point is
the resemblances are the same.
Yeah.
We were talking about that with. I don't want to mention it, but.
Yeah, the resemblances are similar, or characteristics and traits, how they carry themselves, the expressions. You just intuitively go, click, oh my God, I know that person. Where do I know that person from? The vision comes to you and you go, oh my gosh, I lived in Greece with that person, or I lived in France with that person. I was that person's daughter. I was that, oh my gosh, I was that person's lover. I was that person's friend. I mean, and then you get that connection, and then you start interacting, and that's where the community and the unity comes in. So, it comes in as you need it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what if you lived 1,000 lifetimes in 1,000 different timelines? You're going to remember every single.
No.
No,
Just
you're
the
not.
ones that stand out.
The human brain is actually designed to filter most of that information out. Where if you were to compress all that information into a standard brain, you'd probably explode.
Yeah.
So that's probably why, that's pretty much proven. Like we only see like a tiny section of the electromagnetic spectrum. We can't possibly see everything because if we did, we'd go insane.
Yeah.
So you're saying they didn't open the skulls at the top, that the heads opened themselves because they were too full.
Yeah, probably.
Something like that. Yeah.
Probably something like that. Be a little. Can you imagine if you had every night you had a vision of a different lifetime? It would be like so overwhelming. The information would just be so overwhelming for the human brain to process. But I think it's like a trigger, a good trigger, like snap, and then you can make a connection. And so that's how it works with me anyway. But you don't have to feel. And if you've never had any, that's cool because you're just not ready to have that message yet. You could still connect to people at a human level,
right,
and an agape spiritual level, and start a relationship with someone, that groups of people that you've never known from your history, and you never know. Someday you might all of a sudden, and that's how it comes to you. It's a vision. Bam! It's like a scene that's played out before you, and you're like, what play was this?
Well, I love hearing how different people experience things because there's so many different ways. It's
Yep. Very true.
Very much so. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Laird, and we hope to have you when you feel more comfortable about what you're looking into now. Come back on and share with us what you find out.
When the next book's out, but we should be before fall. I would be happy to come back on.
Oh, I love that.
And if you're interested in any of our topics, I can always copy and let you know when we're on and what we're going to be talking about. And
yeah,
if there's anything, because it doesn't have to be just about Dogon, but there might be other things you want to contribute to, and I should send you
learn from.
Or learn from.
Yeah.
Come on, join us on a panel discussion one night.
Absolutely.
If you don't think we're too cray.
No, not at all. Not at all. Thank you very much for having me back on again.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Larry. All right. Well, let's see. Are there any announcements that we need to make, Lori? We do have a show coming up Friday
night.
And we're going to go back into chapter 4 of the Organization of Spiritual Beings. And we are going to go a little bit deeper into what the star seeds are, people's perspectives on what they understand, those interactions with those non-human physical beings from other worlds or other planes of existence. So we want to get into that a little bit deeper. And we have some folks that can talk a little bit about the different races of classifications.
It's an interesting theory because that would tie in with this cultural seeding. That it's probably an ongoing thing to this very day.
Yeah.
That these non-human, non-material beings are in fact guiding the course of human evolution.
Well, might be helping us,
assisting,
helping us, or hurting us.
Well, yeah, there might be some of those that are I don't know, because I don't personally have any gnosis about any of these. So I'll be hearing a lot of this for the first time myself, or bits and pieces of more information than what I've presently learned. But we're talking about the star seeds that were contracted or agreed to come and work with our planet for the greater good of our planet, not necessarily the other beings, which are the non-physical beings from the whole space wars thing and the Council of Aliens and Greys and Lizards and all. We're just dealing with a few of the other star seeds. We're not getting into all the different. There's too many aliens. So we're dealing with the spiritual side of the seeds and where we came from and how we may have evolved, a planet here. So it should be now. That's another discussion, Delabore, where we get deeper into if we wanted to. Robert's already done a show recently on the alien, different types of alien beings.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And they're a whole different breed than what I'm
There's a
talking
lot.
about with the Star
There's a
Kid
lot of
children.
material there,
Yeah.
and that that has relationships to everything else.
Yeah.
Oh, it's you could tie that into almost everything.
Yeah. Yeah. You could.
Well, I hate to talk
Yeah.
around, but I'm out of time here. So, but thank you
Bye.
very much for having
Yep.
me on.
Yep.
And I'd be happy to come back anytime.
All right.
Awesome.
Well, thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you. On that note, we'll say goodbye.
And
to
we're saying
everybody.
goodbye to everybody else too.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thanks very much.